So I have a lot of slides, so I'm just going to dig right in and get started because I'll probably go over my time. So at PCAP, we've been working for the past 5 or 6 years developing habitat attribute guides for species at risk. And I would like to start off by acknowledging the PCAP chairs who have been instrumental in supporting this work, because it's a little bit left field, and so we did need quite a lot of support to get it going. And so the previous chair, Oren Bayless, recognized the value of this to land managers early on and helped develop the approach. And the current chair, Kelly Williamson, also recognizes the value, and he has continued to support the concept and develop the multi-species approach. So it's working. So I'll just start off by giving you the rationale for the need for a multi-species approach. So there are too many grassland species at risk to address with single species approaches. Every day it seems like I get an email to review a proposed listing for some grassland species. So there's a lot, and if you live in Southwest Saskatchewan and you manage a parcel of grassland, even tame grassland, you have species at risk. Large land bases might support more than 10 species at risk, so it's tough to manage for all of them. Species at risk are often at risk because of specific or unique habitat requirements, and that means that species at risk might have different habitat requirements than common species and different habitat requirements than each other. There are overlapping habitat attributes between species, so that means that some species will different species might key on the same attribute, or they might have competing attributes, which means the attributes are mutually exclusive, and there will be some examples of this later on. So for these reasons, single species management can actually reduce habitat quality for other species. So we have to have a multi-species approach. So there are 3 relatively common types of multi-species approaches. There's the indicator or umbrella species approach, which is essentially where you manage for a single species and you assume that other ecologically similar species will respond positively to that management. So, for example, I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with the pronghorn approach, pronghorn as an indicator for multi-species. So we manage for pronghorn, and we hope that the rest of the endemic grassland species also respond positively. There's the guild or species assemblage approach, where species are grouped by similar attributes, which might include resource use or genetic similarity, or those that respond similarly to various management interventions. And so, for example, we have tried in the past to manage multi-species by managing a grassland bird guild. And then there's the ecosystem approach, which is probably the most common. The goal is to provide a variety of ecological conditions within the normal range of variation, and then you assume that that's going to sustain ecosystem structure and function and a full range of biodiversity. So the problem is none of these have worked very well. So the conservation community has been working on multi-species approaches for about 2 decades in North America, and our experience has shown that these approaches support too few species, that there are fine-scale habitat requirements that are often very different between species that aren't addressed by any of these approaches. Habitat requirements are often either not known or not utilized in the approach. Habitat management changes are rarely made, even when species decline. I didn't make up these bullets, this is all from research. Ecosystem approaches are often chosen because they're easier to implement. And experience has shown that multi-species approaches are less effective than single species approaches. One analysis actually found that species are 4 times less likely to improve in status under multi-species approaches. So this is all unacceptable. We have to come up with a multi-species approach that works. So I'm going to just talk about the range health example because I was asked to include it. So the rangeland health is basically an ecosystem management approach that can be applied on a site scale. It's a good system for gauging resiliency and productivity. It's often used in Canada as a surrogate for habitat attributes for species at risk, but it has many of the issues that I described in the last slide. So for example, individual components of range health are, and I'm not going to go into the details about range health because I'm assuming everybody has at least a little bit of familiarity with it. So if you don't, then ask me later. Individual components are relevant to some species at risk, but an overall range health score might mask that importance. So for example, litter is one of the components that you measure in range health. But there's not enough weighting to that individual component to sufficiently affect the overall score. So litter is a really important habitat attribute for a lot of species at risk. Some components of range health are inversely important to species at risk. And what I mean by that is, for example, species like the thick-billed, or we used to call it Michalsky longspur, they like high amounts of bare ground. But with range health, the higher the amount of bare ground, the lower the health score. So even though you're managing positively for Michalsky longspur, the range health score is low, so, which means you're doing poorly. Different species respond differently to a given component. So again, I'll use the bare ground example. So Michalsky longspur, like lots of bare ground, whereas barred sparrow and Sprague's pipit require low amounts of bare ground, so not much bare ground. So a given health score might be positive for one species at risk and negative for another. So the last point there is it doesn't tell you what needs to change for species at risk. So you don't know how to change your management to benefit a species at risk if you're using range health as your multi-species approach. So an overall score might tell you that your rangeland is unhealthy, but it won't tell you what habitat attributes need to change or how they need to change to improve habitat. So what's the solution? Well, a lot of experts recommended that you start with single species, determine detailed habitat requirements, and scale that up to multi-species. They've also recommended that we try a species habitat network approach rather than the other 3 basic multi-species approaches that I described. And a species habitat network approach explicitly links multiple species and habitat resources. It estimates the importance of particular species or specific habitat in a given landscape, and it quantifies the property of habitat networks. So this is the approach that we are using, and we're early on in it. Well, I'll get into where we've gone, but we're early on into it, and we'll see where it goes. So the concept, habitat attribute concept, was originally developed in 2014 by the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance and supported by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. They did the first guide, which was for greater sage-grouse. So in 2014, I believe CWS was developing critical habitat map. We didn't have an emergency order yet. Sage-grouse was a big deal, but it wasn't a disaster. So we started with greater sage-grouse. So the process that we went through to develop these guides is that you do a review of the literature and you come up with a summary of the habitat attributes that a species keys on, and then you gather together the experts in a workshop to verify and expand on those attributes and to put measurements to them, and you'll see what I mean by measurements later. So there is a considerable amount of knowledge of habitat requirements in the experts' minds that's not published anywhere. So the workshops are really important, and we've got a lot of habitat attribute information in the guide that comes from expert opinion. So since that original guide was completed in 2014, between PCAP and SODCAP, we've defined habitat attributes for 11 additional species. These are the 11 additional species, and you're going to tell me who they are, what they are. If I can figure out how to use Q. Oops, well that's not going to work, I guess. Okay, Kaylin, how do I go backwards? Oops, going the wrong way. Ah, thanks. Okay, I was going to try and highlight them on the screen, but I can't, so I'm going to get out. Okay, I'll start with the easy one. What's that? Burrowing owl. Good. This one. Yeah, very good. This one. Very good. This one. Leopard crop. Correct. Okay. Here's why you guys are identifying. What's this? Kelly. I don't think so. And I'm not a bird expert, which is why I'm but you don't know what they look like. Okay, let's leave it and we can maybe do it later by you know, knowing. I think so. And I did it by a process of elimination. I think they're sterile. Chestnut color ones, hurry up in the top. Swift fox, monarch, little brown bat, yeah. Spag, yeah. It's got to be Michalsky. Yes, that's right. That's how I figured out that this one was right. I couldn't figure out what the others were. What areas are a little bit like others. So those are the 11, and of course sage grouse that the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance did. So in the individual guides, we have described habitat attributes on the landscape scale as well as on the site scale, and I'll give you a boring definition of both of those. Landscape scale habitat targets are those attributes that an individual opts for when it's choosing a breeding location or a home range. And so, for example, if you're a grassland bird and you're coming back to Canada from South America and you're flying north and you're in the air, they don't normally go back to where they went last year, or they don't always go back to where they went last year because they're choosing an appropriate habitat. And things change from year to year, right, based on climate. So they may need to go to different places. So they're up in the air and they are looking down from a bird's eye view and choosing what they think is appropriate habitat. So that's the landscape scale. Site scale targets are those attributes that the individual prefers at a certain time of its life, so during breeding or brood rearing or hunting or foraging, or in a certain portion of their home range. And so these are site targets that are specific to where they've already chosen to live. So for grassland birds, their home range is like 4 or 5 hectares. So that's a tiny little area compared to what they're looking at when they're coming back from the south. So landscape scale targets are often land cover, so you know, whether it's crop or grassland, or topography related, but they might also include factors such as whether or not there are other individuals of the same species there. Site factors are most commonly physical vegetation, water, soil, or topography parameters, but they might also include attributes such as configuration of land cover. Some species like a mix of grassland and cropland. Block size, how much of the preferred habitat they need, presence or absence of human infrastructure, and other sort of site scale things. So in the individual species guide, you will see information like this. So this is chestnut-colored longspur. There's identification diagram. There's very high, low resolution, high level map of suitable habitat. So you can get an idea of whether you might be in the general area of suitable habitat or completely outside it, looking at this map, but it won't tell you for sure whether your property is suitable habitat. And what I find kind of interesting about this map is that it's backwards to me because red is suitable and green is unsuitable. It's not normally the colors we use for, stop and go. And then there's a generalized diagram of the things that the species likes and the things that the species avoids. So you can see chestnut-colored longspur avoids areas with dense litter, and it likes low vegetation, low amounts of litter, and 15 to 30% bare ground. So that's the kind of thing you'll see in the individual guide. We have tables in the individual guide outlining the details for landscape scale habitat attributes and site scale habitat attributes. So this is an example, again, chestnut-colored longspur. The landscape scale features that they key on include land cover, topography, soil type, and woody vegetation. And then we have as detailed as the experts can give us the habitat targets. So, for example, the land cover, 70 to 100% grassland within a minimum 400-meter radius is optimal. 50 to 70% grassland, which means 50 to 30% or 30 to 50% is something else besides grassland. Within a minimum 400-meter radius is suboptimal, and I'll explain the optimal suboptimal in a little while. So we've got as detailed information as we can get. Site scale habitat attributes are quite a lot more specific. This is, again, chestnut-colored longspur, so they key in their home range on patch size, plant community, shrub cover, vegetation height, visual obstruction reading, residual grass cover, bare soil combined with biocrass, range condition, not range health, but range condition, habitat at edge, and infrastructure. So, and then we have detailed information. So you can see for vegetation height, we've got 7 to 15 centimeters high is optimal, 3 to 7 or 15 to 20 is suboptimal. So that is all based on actual data. So it's very good. I'll explain that a little more later. So before I move into the multi-species analysis that we're doing, I just wanted to say that the individual guides include non-habitat BMPs, but BMPs are not the focus of this approach. And it's not because there's anything wrong with BMPs, it's just a different approach. So BMP is a management practice that reduces or eliminates a risk. So you're trying to address a risk with BMPs. With the habitat attribute approach, you're trying to provide optimal or maximize the habitat potential for species at risk. So it's kind of like we'll stop that approach, but we'll promote this approach. So it's just a different approach. Let's talk a little bit about habitat quality. So habitat quality can be defined as the ability of the environment to provide conditions appropriate for persistence of individuals and populations. So that's what we're trying to do. Optimal habitat can be defined as the high quality resources selected by individuals of a species. And we assume that individuals select for optimal habitat because it maximizes their reproductive success. Suboptimal habitat can be defined as lower quality resources accepted by the individuals of a species. So they're not selecting for it, they're settling for it. Suboptimal habitat might not maximize the reproductive success, but it's important to support the overall population of a species. And what I mean by that is, if not everybody can have optimal habitat because there isn't enough, we can at least keep the individuals alive so they can breed another year if we provide suboptimal habitat as well as optimal. So this is not a new concept. Shelford's law of tolerance, which is the suboptimal optimal thing, has been around for a century. All we've done is taken it and applied it to species at risk habitat. So wherever possible in this guide, and we need to have data to analyze to come up with the optimal suboptimal. Wherever possible in the guide, we've used optimal and suboptimal metrics for species at risk habitat. So scaling up to multi-species. So here is one of the graphics that we developed for the multi-species guide. And what we've done is we've taken the individual site scale attributes. All the multi-species habitat attributes are based on site scale parameters. So site scale attributes for the 12 species, and we've developed a visual representation. So green is optimal, so opposite from the CDC. Green is optimal, yellow is suboptimal, and red is non-use or inappropriate habitat. So this example is the bare ground graphic for the mixed grass ecoregion. We have graphics for all 4 of the grassland ecoregions. And I've used the mixed grassland today for all of my examples because that's where we are. So attribute preferences vary a little bit from ecoregion to ecoregion, but for the most part, species seem to key in on the same attributes. So the same optimal and suboptimal requirements everywhere across Saskatchewan. So originally we had hypothesized that maybe optimal and suboptimal attributes would vary across ecoregions because we thought species might be just picking the best of what's available, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that they're looking for specific habitat requirements no matter where they go. So you can see from this example, this is bare ground. We've got 5 species that of the 12 that key on bare ground is one of the habitat attributes that's important to them. So you can see there's sparrow and striped pipit, like not very much bare ground. So like 10 to 30%. Whereas the long spurs, they like a lot of bare ground. Thick-billed long spur, its optimal range is up there at 70 to 90%. And then sage grouse doesn't like very much bare ground. But one of the things that I would like to point out for this particular graph is that there is no percentage of bare ground where you can manage for all 5 species. So you would have to make a choice of which you can manage for. Not like you can go 50% and be okay for all of them. You won't get any of them. So this is another graphic. This is litter. Again, another important attribute for a number of species. I have to say this because Kelly's in the room. We had to use, we had data for both estimated litter, which you estimate based on a chart, and you gather it all up. Look, people know, I've seen this done. Gather up a square meter full of litter, and then you have it in your hand and you compare it to a chart. We also have data where they collected it and dried it and weighed it. And I have to say that apparently we're not very good at estimating litter because they're way too different. So we use the estimate because we had a lot more data points that used estimated litter. The trends are the same, but the numbers, the total numbers are not. So anyway, so here we are with the estimated litter chart. And there's two things to note here. So first of all, remember that bare ground was an important attribute for sage-grouse. Litter appears not to be. And where litter is an important attribute for northern leopard frog, bare ground wasn't. So different species have different attributes that are important to them. Also, in this graph, you'll see that the lines between optimal, suboptimal, and non-use are blurred. If I can go backwards, they weren't in this one. That's because where we have good data, where we have a lot of data that we can analyze and give us a lot of confidence in the results, we've used these cutoffs. Where we don't have a lot of data or we're not 100% confident in it, we've used the blurred lines. So it's, you know, approximate cutoffs between optimal, suboptimal, and non-use. So how can this information be used to manage habitat? So habitat management can be defined as influencing the successional stage and physical structure of vegetation to benefit particular species considered to be of high value. And land is managed at the site scale. EcoSites are commonly used in rangeland management worldwide, and I'll describe the definition of an EcoSite. It's not an exciting definition, but a kind of land with a specific potential natural community and a specific physical site characteristic, differing from other kinds of land in its ability to produce vegetation and to respond to management. We have an EcoSite classification for Saskatchewan. Jeff Thorpe developed it in the early 2000s, finished in 2007. The publications are on the PCAP website. The grassland ecoregions were mapped, the EcoSites were mapped, and that GIS map data is housed with the Saskatchewan CDC. So we have the basis to manage at the site scale. So here's a table of the EcoSites for Saskatchewan, and I won't go through them in detail. We basically have, I can't remember how many is there. There's about 20 or something like that. And they've divided up into dry EcoSites, zonal EcoSites, which is the gradation between dry and moist, moist EcoSites, and saline EcoSites. And they're fairly self-explanatory. I mean, you have badlands, you have solonets, dunes, sand. So I'm not going to go into any more detail of those. I'm just going to go into some examples of how we've used them in the guide. So this is the loam EcoSite, and I picked it because there's lots in the SODCAP area. So all the red is loam EcoSite, and it's overlain on the 4 ecoregions. So that's why it's sometimes red, it's sometimes pink, because we've got the aspen parkland and the moist mixed grass and the mixed grassland and the cypress upland underneath it. So this is a map from the CDC that was provided to us through a partnership with SODCAP. They actually provided all the EcoSite maps for us. And the loam EcoSite is a zonal EcoSite that's found on stable, well-drained uplands with medium to moderately fine textured soil. So in order to make this a little bit meaningful to somebody on the ground, we've included the typical plant communities on loamy EcoSites and here this is specifically for the mixed grassland ecoregion. The typical plant communities on a loam EcoSite in a different ecoregion would be different plant communities. So the reference plant community is essentially the potential of the site, the EcoSite, in the absence of disturbance or any invasion by non-native species. So the reference community on the loam ecosite is northern wheatgrass, needle and thread. And then those communities change as they are subject to disturbance. So disturbance could be grazing or fire or even drought. So with a little bit of disturbance, you get minor alterations, and the needle and thread moves to dominant, and you start getting in some of the shorter grasses like June grass and bluegrass. Moderate alteration, the taller cool season grasses start to become less dominant, and the shorter, warmer season grasses start to become dominant. And I should just explain that we name the communities by the dominant or indicator species that are in them, and the order in which they're provided there is the order of how common they are. So in the northern wheatgrass, needle and thread, northern wheatgrass would be the most common species, needle and thread second most common. So you can see that as you introduce disturbance, you get shorter grasses as becoming more dominant. So what that means is that these different plant communities will have a different capacity to support different species. So some species will respond positively to shorter grass, some to taller grass. So in the guide, we also have a list of the species at risk found on each, or with the potential to be found on each loam ecosite. And again, this was provided to us from the TDC. The loamy site in the mixed grassland, which is red there, I've highlighted in red, has the potential to support all 12 of the species that we've included in the guide. And just notice that that's not the case in the other ecoregions, and that's not because the loamy ecosite isn't capable of supporting all those species. It just means that their range has contracted outside of the moist mixed grass and cypress uplands and aspen parklands, so that they're only left in the mixed grassland. So another example, different ecosite. So this is the solanesic ecosite. It's a dry ecosite, and it occurs on landscapes with solanesic soil. It's characterized by a hard, impermeable B horizon, which is high in sodium, and most of us recognize it because it's got these scattered depressions in it that we call burnouts or blowouts, where the organic horizon has been eroded off, and all you see is the hard pan B horizon. So you can see there's a fair amount in the far southwest of Saskatchewan, a little bit around where we are here. And again, we have typical plant communities for this, and they're actually not that different from the loamy site. That's not always the case. But again, you have the same sort of trend. So the reference community is northern wheatgrass, needle and thread June grass, and as you introduce disturbance, the taller cool season grasses start to fall off, and you get more shorter warm season grasses. So when we have the list of species at risk for the solanesic site, only 10 of the 12 species have the potential to occur on this ecosite in the mixed grassland ecoregion. So the habitat potential on the solanesic ecosite is not suitable for either piping plover or sprague pipit, and so that means we don't need to manage for those species on that ecosite. You can obtain an EcoSite map of your property through Habitat, which is Saskatchewan's online GIS interactive database. It's not that easy to use, so you can also contact PCAP or probably SODCAP and get them to do that for you. And they can also give you a list of the species at risk that have been found near you or have the potential to occur on a property that you manage. So how to manage for habitat attributes, multiple habitat attributes. This is where it gets a lot more complex. And we are actually going to be working on a companion guide to this guide to help work land managers through this process. I'm going to keep it fairly simple for this presentation because that would be a whole presentation in itself. So habitat attributes, as we know, can be changed by grazing, fire, or climate. One of the things that several researchers noted is that the management regime needs to be, I can say it, it just didn't come, needs to be changed periodically. And so the simplest application of that is, not in my words, but in the words of one of the researchers, is that any concurrent use of any number of different grazing intensities is better than a single intensity covering an entire land base. So it's basically about changing it up. It's not about a grazing prescription, it's about adaptive management. Habitat attributes will change from year to year, even without disturbance, due just to climate impact. And so the key to management is adapting your disturbance regime so that the potential to support species isn't lost. And adaptive management uses methods that create resiliency to climate change. Managing for species at risk uses the same techniques, but the habitat attributes are different and they're more specific. But ultimately, adaptive range management might be the only method of retaining resilience and providing habitat attributes suitable for supporting species at risk. So we're going to be digging into adaptive management a little deeper for our companion guide. So adaptive management is basically defined as a way of dealing with the complexities and extremes of ecosystems which are dynamic and unpredictable. It involves regular monitoring, reviewing and revising management actions across both time and space. So I have some examples of that. It can be implemented in two ways. So there's enterprise flexibility, which involves changes in things like livestock herd structure, type, and number of animals. If your enterprise is a conservation organization, maybe the ability to use prescribed fire is one of the things that you can change in there. Herd structure is basically, you might want to use yearlings instead of, as well as cow-calves. Type of livestock, you might want to use sheep in certain situations and cattle in other situations. And of course, the number of animals can be adjusted, which is how you change grazing intensity. But there's also management flexibility, which can involve both reactive or proactive action. So reactive strategies are pretty common, and I'm sure that some of you are familiar with these strategies because these are strategies that a lot of us are considering this year because of the drought. So things like reducing herd size, weaning cows early, selling retained yearlings, purchasing feed, renting additional pasture, moving livestock to another location, and placing livestock in a feedlot. Those are all reactive strategies. So we have a drought, we have to do something. That's a reaction. And those actions are helpful for resilience, but they're not so helpful for managing habitat attributes. Proactive strategies are something we need to consider if we're going to incorporate habitat attribute management. And some examples of proactive strategies, using conservative stocking rates relative to the potential of the EcoSite, and we have the potential of the EcoSite in the Thorpe publications. One of the analyses that he did was carrying capacity for each of these sites. We can use weather predictions to adjust stocking rates. One of the things that I did this year was I reduced the stocking rate because we're going into the 4th year of drought where I am, and when I knew we were going to have the 4th year, the productivity's been declining for 3 years, and I knew it was going down again. So I reduced the stocking rate on my normal summer pasture rotation, and then I incorporated actually one of my hay fields into the summer pasture to adjust for that reduction in stocking rate. So varying grazing regimes across the land base and across time. So an example of this would be, so maybe you have intensive cell grazing on one pasture, you have deferred grazing on another pasture, you have season-long grazing on another pasture. So those are all varying grazing regimes. But then you have to change those up over time. So the next year you need to move your cell grazing onto another pasture, and you move your deferred grazing onto the cell grazing, and change it around. So that's varying grazing regimes. Resting some pastures for an entire grazing season, alternating rest over space and time. So I worked once with a producer who had 3 extremely large pastures. And what he did was he put all his cows in one pasture for the first half of the year, moved them into another pasture for the second half of the year, and the third pasture rested. And then he changed that up every year. So it's a different pasture that got rested the next year. Pastures never have the same treatment 2 years in a row. So you didn't get early season grazing on the same pasture 2 years. That was changed around too. So that's alternating it over space and time. Then you can do some things like grass banking, stock climbing pastures, or incorporating yearlings. Yearlings are one of the strategies because they're so good at distributing themselves, and they can sometimes distribute themselves into the neighbor's pasture, which is why I don't use them. So proactive strategies have a greater potential to benefit habitat for wildlife because you don't lose the potential of the EcoSite. So I think I will wrap it up here. I just wanted to say thanks to a few people. So Carolyn Godet, the coordinator for Saskatchewan PCAP, has been tirelessly raising money for this project for several years. Michelle Lenoy from SODCAP, who prepared all the EcoSite Map and all the species lists for us. Stephen Davis from CWS, who analyzed over 4,000 points of bird habitat data to come up with those optimal and suboptimal parameters for all the grassland birds. Heather Pete Ham, who is my co-author on this document, who developed all of the multi-species graphics. And Eric Green, who pulled together databases for those 12 species.